Our speaker for today is Professor Emeritus Chris Rogers. And so Emeritus Professor Chris Rogers is a professor of geotechnical engineering at the University of Birmingham. With a distinguished career spanning academia and industry, he has advanced research in infrastructure engineering and sustainable urban future. His pioneering works include leading the Mapping and Assessing the Underworld and Self-Repairing Cities program, developing robotic and smart technologies for subsurface infrastructure. Emeritus Professor Chris Rogers is a founding member and director of research integration for UKCRIC. He has shaped national research on resilience, livable cities, and so much more. Professor Rogers' transdisciplinary approach continues to influence sustainable city design, urban diagnostic, and future infrastructure.
Hi, my name is Chris Rogers. Until recently, a professor of geotechnical engineering at the University of Birmingham, now an emeritus professor. I'm very much a civil engineer in the most general sense. And what I want to talk to you about is a theory of change for livable cities, or what I would then call more livable cities. And I want to acknowledge, first of all of those programs that I've been working on for more than 25 years now at the University of Birmingham, underpinned by EUCRIC, which is the UK Collaboratorium for Research on Infrastructure and Cities. So very broad picture collaboration across 15 universities in the UK. And here are the logos of the many grants that I've been associated with, most of which have been funded by the Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council. And I'd like to acknowledge all of those people with whom I have collaborated on these grants. Very much multidisciplinary, multi-university, but moving forward towards transdisciplinary working, which is essential if we're going to tackle the challenge of livable cities. So first of all, a brief snapshot of something I was involved with getting on for 10 years ago now. Funded by the UK government, it's the Foresight Future of Cities programme. And the point of bringing this in is that what we were charged with doing over a 30-month period was providing advice to the government on what it should be thinking about with regard to cities of the far future, so 25, 50 years hence. And to make life easier for ourselves, we did talk about looking at the cities of the far future through different lenses, and here are 6 of those lenses. And we carried out a whole bunch of work, as the Americans would say, looking at commissioning expert reviews, doing trend analysis, doing analytics, but very specifically doing scenarios. And scenarios are really important if one is looking into the far future, on the basis that predictions and projections take the current baseline and look forward, and all that one would be quite sure of is that the projections will be imperfect at best, inaccurate at worst. So it's a question not of whether they will be wrong, but of how wrong. Whereas if you use scenario analysis, then you can look towards the far future with far greater confidence. But I guess the real point I wanted to draw from that is that all city systems, and those were the systems we were looking at, or infrastructure and urban systems, if you wish, are interdependent to some degree. So if we intervene in one system, all of the others are going to be impacted to a greater or lesser degree. So let me come on to a theory of change. We start with the outcomes that we are seeking to deliver. So we need to identify those outcomes and then understand what we would need to happen in order for those outcomes to be delivered. And this work that I'm going to be talking about is written up in what we call a little book of theory of change for infrastructure and cities. And it's freely available, and you can download it. And what you will see is that it is made up then of a number of different methodologies that we've pieced together from our research programs then over the past 25 or more years. So the starting point, if we're going to be looking at sustainability, resilience and livability of cities, and I'm looking at more livable cities, and the reason why we have livability in there is because we need to put people on the planet much more consciously at the center of our thinking, rather than looking more abstractly at this, this idea of systems that operate. And the first point is we need to identify all of the stakeholders. And what I will then talk about in terms of a civil engineering process is then looking at intervention in the system of systems to bring about change, beneficial change. And if I'm looking at an intervention, what I need to understand is who are the stakeholders who would be influenced by it, and who are the stakeholders who will influence the intervention. And I need to understand that the totality of those stakeholders, if I am to properly then identify how to create that intervention so that it satisfies all of the stakeholders. And in order to do that, I need to map the system of interest in relation then to all of the other infrastructure and urban systems, in order to understand the dependencies and the interdependencies between the systems. And here is an example. So this is an example of what I would call a system map, what my researcher would call a value generating opportunity map, in this case for infrastructure asset management. But the key point is that once I have this system diagram, the system map, I can then interrogate it to understand all of those stakeholders that should be considered in the devising of the intervention that I'm talking about. So I have my stakeholder map. I then, and what I perhaps ought to say is that that original map I showed is only very much the first level, and in fact, of course, if you do a very complete stakeholder map for a particular program of work, it does get very detailed, very complicated, if you wish. But it allows me to do that analysis of understanding who all the stakeholders are, and therefore who needs to be considered. So once I've then moved forward with my my mapping and my stakeholder identification, what I then need to do is I need to identify or understand all of the aspirations of the stakeholders. Because if I were to take all of the stakeholders' aspirations and combine them, then what they would create what I would call a design brief. This is now looking at the desired outcomes from an intervention, and of course that intervention as an engineering protocol could be to create an artifact. It could be to create some sort of operational system. It could be, in fact, simply to design a policy. So whether it's a policy, a practice, or something that is physically created is immaterial. We still need to go through the same process of understanding what the outcomes, what are the outcomes that we're looking to achieve. And all interventions then happen in a context, and so we need to understand fully the context in which the works are being carried out. So something that might be applicable in a dense urban area might be totally inappropriate for a small town or a village or whatever. So understanding the context and what might work there in London might not work in Nottingham, or might not work in Milton Keynes or whatever. And of course, we need to know what problem we are solving in all its dimensions. And so typically an intervention is put into place to deal with a challenge or a problem, or to deliver something new. So how does the world work currently is a critical question. So we need to establish the baseline performance of how things are currently performing. And so if I'm now talking of livability of cities, how livable is a particular place, working with its infrastructure and urban systems. If I understand how it's performing now, what I can then do is do the engineering thing. Now, the engineering thing is applying ingenuity to solve problems. That's what engineers do. I mean, essentially, we are problem solvers, and we bring engineering to bear. So this is the thing that sets engineers apart. But of course, what it also suggests is that everybody is, to some degree, an engineer, because we all look at the problems and work out how to solve them. The key point here is that all of those other elements that I list above have to be addressed before I start to jump to solutions. And one of the real problems with engineering is that engineers love to do solutions. They don't necessarily like to do all of that earlier stuff. So what I then do is come back to my system map, because what I can now look at is how the system operates in relation to all of those other all of those items that you see on the page. So how does it relate in terms of delivering on those associated points of interest? And where do the problems lie in all of those points of interest with regard to my particular activity? So what I can then do is I can look at the way the world works, and I can then look at how I might make it more livable. For example, integrating green space into our urban areas far more intensively. So I could look at the problems. Where is green space lacking? Where is it not interconnected? Therefore, doesn't provide the biodiversity corridors that are needed to enrich the biodiversity, and so on and so on. And what I can then do is I can look at how that intervention might work today, because I know the way the world works today. I can see it. I can look at the context, and I can then anticipate how it will work. But of course, what we do as civil engineers is put things into place that will last a very long time, typically decades, sometimes hundreds of years. And so what we need to do is understand whether what works or might work today is likely to work in the far future. So we need a futures analysis, and we have one of those that was developed, looking at extreme yet plausible futures for the way the world works, to examine whether if I were to put something in place today, it is likely to work, or it might be vulnerable in the far future. And only then can I create what I call business models. And here, what I'm talking about is all of the positive outcomes of a system change balanced against all the negative outcomes. It is not simply a cost and return on investment model. It is looking at how a particular design might yield a set of outcomes, and understanding how to then enrich the positive outcomes, enhance the positive outcomes, if you wish, and remove or reduce the negative outcomes by design iteration. And of course, in order to develop my business model, I can look at the outcomes in relation to all of those points that are listed on this system map. So how does my intervention either positively or negatively affect all of those points, or in some cases it might have no effect at all? But if I understand the totality of the positive outcomes, or the value raised, and the negative outcomes, or the value compromised, then it allows me to change my design to deliver the widest range of possible value, and to de-risk the investment by making transparent all the likely consequences of the intervention. And then I can look at how I can make a case for change based upon the let us call it the most valuable design. And then I can look at how it might work in relation to all of the forms of governance, both formal forms of governance, the codes and standards and legislation and rules and so on, and the informal forms of governance, that is, how people, the stakeholders, will relate to it. Social norms, practice norms, all of those things. But of course, the forms of governance form part of the context, and therefore I will have considered those already. So then what I'm now doing is looking at whether I need to change any of the forms of governance to deliver. And so this is the UCRIC collaboration, as I talked about this right at the start. 15 universities, all of whom work in this sphere of infrastructure and cities. And we at the University of Birmingham were one of the core members. I was one of the 7 original bidders for the UCRIC investment of £138 million, matched investment in facilities around the country. And it is from those the interactions with all of these universities and their staff that we then were able to develop our theory of change, and that's how you would get in touch with me. Sorry I can't be with you live because I'm at a conference overseas, but I think that gives you an introduction to what I was going to be thinking about. Thank you.